And the answer to the question is that one cannot establish the existence of inviolable rights unless one accepts two further principles: the equality of humans, the notion that myself, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Member for North East Somerset, and indeed somebody that we have never encountered at the other end of the Congo, is in all important respects equal in dignity and rights. This is an insight of logic.
He thinks that the individual person, all human beings, have a certain dignity that commands our respect. The reason the individual is sacred, or the bearer of rights according to Kant, doesn't stem from the idea that we own ourselves, but instead from the idea that we are all rational beings. We're all rational beings, which simply means that we are beings who are capable of reason. We are also autonomous beings, which is to say that we are beings capable of acting and choosing freely. Of course, we seek to avoid pain, and we like pleasure. Kant doesn't deny this. What he does deny is Bentham's claim that pain and pleasure are our sovereign masters. He thinks that's wrong. Respecting human dignity means regarding persons not just as means, but also as ends in themselves. And this is why it's wrong to use people for the sake of other people's well-being or happiness. The moral worth of an action depends on the motive for which it's done, and the important thing is that the person do the right thing for the right reason. The idea is that the motive confers the moral worth on an action. And the only kind of motive that can confer moral worth on an action is the motive of duty. Well, what's the opposite of doing something out of a sense of duty because it's right? Well, for Kant, the opposite would be all of those motives having to do with our inclinations. And inclinations refer to all of our desires, all of our contingently given wants, preferences, impulses, and the like. Kant does acknowledge, you're pressing Kant on an important point here. Kant does say there has to be some incentive to obey the moral law. It can't be a self-interested incentive. That would defeat it by definition. So he speaks of a different kind of incentive from an inclination. He speaks of reverence for the moral law. If acting autonomously means acting according to a law I give myself, that's how I escape the chain of cause and effect and the laws of nature. What's to guarantee that the law I give myself when I'm acting out of duty is the same as the law that Amati is giving himself, and that each of you gives yourselves? Well, here's the question. How many moral laws, from Kant's point of view, are there in this room? Are there 1,000 or is there one? Here's Kant's answer. The reason that leads us to the law we give ourselves as autonomous beings is a reason, it's a kind of practical reason that we share as human beings. It's not idiosyncratic. The reason we need to respect the dignity of persons is that we're all rational beings. We all have the capacity for reason, and it's the exercise of that capacity for reason which exists undifferentiated in all of us that makes us worthy of dignity, all of us, and since it's the same capacity for reason, unqualified by particular autobiographies and life circumstances. It's the same universal capacity for reason that delivers the moral law. It turns out that to act autonomously is to act according to a law we give ourselves, exercising our reason, but it's the reason we share with everyone as rational beings, not the particular reasons we have given our upbringings, our particular values, our particular interests. It's pure practical reason in Kant's terms, which legislates a priori, regardless of any particular contingent or empirical ends. Well, what moral law would that kind of reason deliver? What is its content? Kant's groundwork is about two big questions. First, what is the supreme principle of morality? Second, how is freedom possible? Two big questions. Now, one way of making your way through this dense philosophical book is to bear in mind a set of oppositions or contrasts or dualisms that are related. Today I'd like to talk about them. Today we're going to answer the question, what, according to Kant, is the supreme principle of morality? And in answering that question, in working our way up to Kant's answer to that question, it will help to bear in mind three contrasts or dualisms that Kant sets out. The first, you remember, had to do with the motive according to which we act. And according to Kant, only one kind of motive is consistent with morality. The motive of duty, doing the right thing for the right reason. What other kind of motives are there? Kant sums them up in the category of inclination. Every time the motive for what we do is to satisfy a desire or a preference that we may have to pursue some interest, we're acting out of inclination. Maybe very often people do have self-interested motives when they act. Kant wouldn't dispute that. But what Kant is saying is that insofar as we act morally, that is, insofar as our actions have moral worth, what confers moral worth is precisely our capacity to rise above self-interest and prudence and inclination and to act out of duty. And that leads us to the second contrast, the link between morality and freedom. The second contrast describes two different ways that my will can be determined, autonomously and heteronomously. And according to Kant, I'm only free when my will is determined autonomously, which means what? According to a law that I give myself. We must be capable, if we're capable of freedom as autonomy, we must be capable of acting according not to a law that's given or imposed on us, but according to a law we give ourselves. But where could such a law come from? A law that we give ourselves. reason. If reason determines my will, then the will becomes the power to choose independent of the dictates of nature or inclination or circumstance. So, connected with Kant's demanding notions of morality and freedom is a specially demanding notion of reason. Well, how can reason determine the will? There are two ways, and this leads to the third contrast. Kant says there are two different commands of reason. And a command of reason, Kant calls an imperative. An imperative is simply an ought. One kind of imperative, perhaps the most familiar kind, is a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives use instrumental reason. If you want X, then do Y. It's means-ends reasoning. If you want a good business reputation, then don't shortchange your customers, word may get out. That's a hypothetical imperative. If the action would be good solely as a means to something else, Kant writes the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will which of itself accords with reason, then the imperative is categorical. That's the difference between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical one. A categorical imperative commands categorically, which just means without reference to or dependence on any further purpose. And so you see the connection among these three parallel contrasts. To be free in the sense of autonomous requires that I act not out of a hypothetical imperative, but out of a categorical imperative. And so you see, by these three contrasts, Kant reasons his way, brings us up to his derivation of the categorical imperative. Well, this leaves us one big question. What is the categorical imperative? What is the supreme principle of morality? What does it command of us? Kant gives three versions, three formulations of the categorical imperative. The first version, the first formula, he calls the formula of the universal law. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And by maxim, what does Kant mean? He means a rule that explains the reason for what you're doing, a principle. Is that consistent with the categorical imperative, that false promise? Kant says no. And the test, the way we can determine that the false promise is at odds with the categorical imperative is try to universalize it. Universalize the maxim upon which you're about to act. If everybody made false promises when they needed money, then nobody would believe those promises. There would be no such thing as a promise. And so there would be a contradiction. The maxim universalized would undermine itself. I think what he's saying is that this is the test. This is the test of whether the maxim corresponds with the categorical imperative. It isn't exactly the reason. It's not the reason. The reason you should universalize to test your maxim is to see whether you are privileging your particular needs and desires over everybody else's. It's a way of pointing to this feature, this demand of the categorical imperative, that the reasons for your action shouldn't depend, or their justification, on your interests, your needs, your special circumstances being more important than somebody else's. That, I think, is the moral intuition lying behind the universalization test. So let me spell out Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, perhaps in a way that's more intuitively accessible than the formula of universal law. It's the formula of humanity as an end. Kant introduces the second version of the categorical imperative with the following line of argument. We can't base the categorical imperative on any particular interest, purposes, or ends, because then it would be only relative to the person whose ends they were. But suppose there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute value, an end in itself, then in it, and in it alone, would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative. Well, what is there that we can think of as having its end in itself? Kant's answer is this. I say that man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means for arbitrary use by this or that will. And here Kant distinguishes between persons on the one hand and things on the other. Rational beings are persons. They don't just have a relative value for us, but if anything they have an absolute value, an intrinsic value. That is, rational beings have dignity. They're worthy of reverence and respect. This line of reasoning leads Kant to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is this. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So that's the formula of humanity as an end. The idea that human beings, as rational beings, are ends in themselves, not open to use, merely as a means. When I make a false promise to you, I'm using you as a means to my ends, to my desire for the $100. And so I'm failing to respect you. I'm failing to respect your dignity. I'm manipulating you. The reason that we have to respect the dignity of other people has not to do with anything in particular about them. And so respect, Kantian respect, is unlike love in this way. It's unlike sympathy. It's unlike solidarity or fellow feeling or altruism. Because love and those other particular virtues or reasons for caring about other people have to do with who they are in particular. But respect for Kant, respect is respect for humanity, which is universal, for a rational capacity which is universal. Now, fully to make sense of Kant's moral theory in the groundwork requires that we be able to answer three questions. How can duty and autonomy go together? What's the great dignity in answering to duty? It would seem that these two ideas are opposed, duty and autonomy. What's Kant's answer to that? Because acting out of duty is following a moral law
that you impose on yourself.
That you impose on yourself. That's what makes duty compatible with freedom. Kant's answer is, it is not insofar as I am subject to the law that I have dignity, but rather insofar as, with regard to that very same law, I'm the author, and I'm subordinated to that law on that grounds that I took it, as Matt just said, I took it upon myself. I willed that law. So that's why, for Kant, acting according to duty and acting freely, in the sense of autonomously, are one and the same. But that raises the question, how many moral laws are there? Because if dignity consists in being governed by a law that I give myself, what's to guarantee that my conscience will be the same as your conscience? Who has Kant's answer to that? Yes?
Because a moral law is not contingent upon subjective conditions. It would transcend all particular differences between people, and so would be a universal law. And in this respect, there would only be one moral law, because it would be supreme.
That's exactly right. What's your name?
Kelly?
Kelly. So, Kelly, Kant believes that if we choose freely, out of our own consciences, the moral law, we're guaranteed to come up with one and the same moral law.
Yes.
And that's because when I choose, it's not me, Michael Sandel, choosing. It's not you, Kelly, choosing for yourself. What is it exactly? Who's doing the choosing? Who's the subject? Who's the agent who's doing the choosing?
Reason?
Well, reason.
Pure reason.
Pure reason. And what you mean by pure reason is what exactly?
Well, pure reason is, like we were saying before, not subject to any external conditions that may be imposed on it.
Good.
So.
That's great. So the reason that does the willing, the reason that governs my will when I will the moral law, is the same reason that operates when you choose the moral law for yourself.
Yes.
And that's why it's possible to act autonomously, to choose for myself, for each of us to choose for ourselves as autonomous beings, and for all of us to wind up willing the same moral law, the categorical imperative. But then there is one big and very difficult question left. Even if you accept everything that Matt and Kelly have said so far, how is a categorical imperative possible? How is morality possible? To answer that question, Kant says we need to make a distinction. We need to make a distinction between two standpoints. Two standpoints from which we can make sense of our experience. Let me try to explain what he means by these two standpoints. As an object of experience, I belong to the sensible world. There, my actions are determined by the laws of nature and by the regularities of cause and effect. But as a subject of experience, I inhabit an intelligible world. Here, being independent of the laws of nature, I am capable of autonomy, capable of acting according to a law I give myself. Now, Kant says that only from this second standpoint can I regard myself as free. For to be independent of determination by causes in the sensible world is to be free. If I were wholly an empirical being, as the utilitarians assume, if I were a being wholly and only subject to the deliverances of my senses, to pain and pleasure and hunger and thirst and appetite, if that's all there were to humanity, we wouldn't be capable of freedom, Kant reasons. Because in that case, every exercise of will would be conditioned by the desire for some object. In that case, all choice would be heteronymous choice, governed by the pursuit of some external end. When we think of ourselves as free, Kant writes, we transfer ourselves into the intelligible world as members and recognize the autonomy of the will. That's the idea of the two standpoints. So, how are categorical imperatives possible? Only because the idea of freedom makes me a member of an intelligible world. Now, Kant admits we aren't only rational beings. We don't only inhabit the intelligible world, the realm of freedom. If we did, then all of our actions would invariably accord with the autonomy of the will. But precisely because we inhabit simultaneously the two standpoints, the two realms, the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity, precisely because we inhabit both realms, there is always potentially a gap between what we do and what we ought to do, between is and ought. Another way of putting this point, and this is the point with which Kant concludes the groundwork, morality is not empirical. Whatever you see in the world, whatever you discover through science, can't decide moral questions. Morality stands at a certain distance from the world, from the empirical world. And that's why no science could deliver moral truth. And the reason it's wrong, he said, is once you start taking consequences into account to carve out exceptions to the categorical imperative, you've given up the whole moral framework. You've become a consequentialist, or maybe a rule utilitarian.
And the answer to the question is that one cannot establish the existence of inviolable rights unless one accepts two further principles: the equality of humans, the notion that myself, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Member for North East Somerset, and indeed somebody that we have never encountered at the other end of the Congo, is in all important respects equal in dignity and rights. This is an insight of logic.
I think that the golf cart exchange sort of brought up what I see as my main objection to this theological mode of reasoning. I mean, Michael, I think that was your name, right? Believes that walking is an inherent part of golf. Myself, I believe that walking is not an inherent part of golf. And I feel that no matter how long we debate this particular point of contention, we're never going to reach an accord. The theological framework of reasoning, I believe, doesn't really allow us to come to any sort of agreement.
All right, and what's your name?
Patrick.
Patrick. All right, let me try to address this set of objections to Aristotle. Let me start with Patrick's. It's an important objection. We had a debate about whether walking is essential to golf, and even in so seemingly trivial, or at least contained a case as that, we couldn't agree. How can we possibly hope to agree when the stakes are higher and when we're debating the fundamental purposes or ends of political community? And so if we can't agree on what the ends or the goods of our shared public life consist in, how can we base justice and rights on some notion of what the end or the purpose or the good consists in? That's an important objection, so much so that much modern political theory takes that worry about disagreement over the good as its starting point and concludes that justice and rights and constitutions should not be based on any particular conception of the good or the purposes of political life, but should instead provide a framework of rights that leaves people free to choose their conceptions of the good, their own conceptions of the purposes of life.